The hall is alive with fire and noise. Torches sputter against carved wooden beams blackened with years of smoke. Horns roar. Mead splashes across tables worn smooth by generations of feasts. Men shout verses of half-remembered sagas until the very walls seem to tremble with their drunken chants. You stand at the center of it all, a young bride whose world has narrowed to the weight of a rough wool cloak pressed over your shoulders and the crushing awareness that every eye in this smoke-filled room is fixed on you. The air is thick with sweat and ale, so heavy it steals your breath. Faces leer from the shadows, not tender witnesses to a sacred union, but warriors scarred and eager, their laughter carrying the unmistakable rhythm of ritual. This night does not belong to you, it belongs to them. What should have been private, the quiet trembling of a first union, has been transformed into spectacle, demanded as proof, shouted as honor. Your silence will be their shame, your pain, their entertainment. And as the chanting rises like a tide around you, a truth settles like ice in your chest. In this world, a wedding night is not the beginning of love. It is the triumph of the clan. Behind the myths of golden ships and glorious raids, shadows remain. Rituals too horrific to survive in the sagas, too brutal to be celebrated in the stories we tell ourselves about Viking courage and exploration. The Viking age stretched from the late 8th to the 11th centuries, spilling from the icy fjords of Scandinavia into Britain, Ireland, Francia, and the Slavic world. Popular memory celebrates it as an age of fearless explorers and master shipwrights. But marriage, seemingly mundane, was one of its darkest institutions. Viking wedding nights were not tender beginnings but communal performances designed to bind women as property, seal alliances between powerful families, and display dominance in the most intimate way imaginable. Icelandic law codes, Norse sagas, and clerical chroniclers like Adam of Bremen give us glimpses into what the myths tried to bury: rituals of humiliation, forced consummations, and the systematic reduction of intimacy into legal contract. What today is retold as romantic Viking weddings often masks a brutal truth deliberately sanitized by later storytellers who could not bear to admit what their ancestors had done. The wedding feast did not end with laughter, it ended with law. Behind the songs of harps and the clinking of horns lay an institution older and harsher than any fleeting passion. Marriage as a contract, not between two hearts, but between families, clans, and in some cases, entire villages. To modern minds, it is tempting to imagine a Viking bride blushing under garlands of flowers, welcomed into her new home with gentle hands and kind words. But the record left behind in law codes, sagas, and scattered clerical chronicles speaks of something else entirely. A ritualized humiliation designed to strip a woman of her past, her name, and her privacy in one single night. The saga writers and Icelandic lawmakers used euphemisms to disguise these moments. Phrases like "the bedding was witnessed" or "the blood was shown." What this meant in practice was far more chilling. The consummation of a marriage was not a private union but a public performance, staged before witnesses who had a vested interest in its completion. In many halls, once the feast was over, the bride would be escorted to the bed by the entire household. Witnesses stood by, sometimes chanting verses, sometimes jeering until proof of her virginity was demanded. A stained sheet, a cry in the darkness, a boast from the groom, these became tokens of legitimacy. Without them, alliances could crumble, dowries be revoked, entire families ruined. The horror lay not simply in the act itself, but in the systematic transformation of intimacy into spectacle, of the most vulnerable moment in a young woman's life into a performance demanded by law and custom. One saga recounts the marriage of a man who later became king of Norway. His bride paraded before warriors who carried torches, and demanded proof that the union was complete before the night ended. Chroniclers who wrote centuries later softened these accounts, presenting them as quaint traditions. But the chilling undercurrent is impossible to ignore. A bride was not merely a wife, she was a public offering, her body the seal on a contract written in silver and blood. The transactional nature of these rituals was embedded in the law itself, codified with the same precision Vikings used to navigate unknown seas. The Gulathing and Frostathing codes, two of the oldest Norwegian legal collections, made explicit the fines and punishments for refusing consummation. A bride who resisted was labeled nithingr, a coward, a dishonor to her family and clan. Such a status could destroy not only her but her entire family's standing in the community. To be named nithingr was worse than death in Viking society. It stripped a person of protection under the law, leaving them open to violence without recourse or justice. Thus, refusal was not an option. It was not simply the will of a husband that weighed upon her, but the entire machinery of Viking society, every custom and code designed to ensure her compliance. Even the economic framework reinforced this dehumanization. A bride was measured in silver and cattle, her body equated to livestock in the calculations of powerful men. Bride price, called munda, was paid by the groom's family to secure her, while a dowry, heimanfylgja, was demanded from her own kin. Both sides were investing not in love but in breeding potential and alliance security, in the promise of sons who would carry forward the family name and daughters who could be exchanged in turn. If the glimpses into these forgotten shadows grip you, If you find yourself drawn to the buried truths that history tried to erase, then subscribe to this channel. Every video we create pulls back another layer of the past, revealing the stories that make us uncomfortable, the truths that challenge what we thought we knew about our ancestors. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because uncovering these histories is something we do together, one revelation at a time. In many cases, if the marriage was not consummated, these payments could be challenged or revoked, plunging families into financial ruin. The pressure to produce proof of intimacy was therefore not only cultural but financial, a debt that had to be paid in the most personal currency imaginable. Families watched closely, eager to ensure their investment was validated, their silver not wasted on a bride who could not fulfill her purpose. Consider the chilling implication. A woman's most intimate moment was also her receipt, her body serving as the ledger of contract, the proof of transaction. Contemporary accounts deepen the dread. Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century about the pagan practices of Scandinavia, noted that Viking feasts often blurred the line between ritual and law in ways that shocked even hardened Christian observers. In his descriptions of weddings, the union of bride and groom was likened to a sacrifice, a necessary act to seal a covenant not only between families but also with the gods themselves. This framing added another layer of coercion, transforming resistance into blasphemy. A bride who hesitated was not just defying her groom but insulting the divine order, risking the wrath of powers beyond mortal understanding. The sagas preserve whispers of blood rituals tied to weddings, disputes over virginity and consummation that erupted into feuds and killings that could span generations. Men's honor was directly tied to women's bodies, making every wedding night a potential spark for violence that could consume entire clans. Virginity was not a private matter of purity but a communal resource, guarded and weaponized by law and custom, transformed into a commodity more valuable than gold. And then there were the captives, the women whose stories are even darker than those of freeborn brides. Raiding was the lifeblood of Viking expansion, and with raids came thralls, slaves taken from Ireland, the Baltic, or Slavic lands, and dragged back to Scandinavia in chains. Many of these women were forcibly married into households, their weddings little more than staged ceremonies masking systematic abduction. Archaeological digs in Viking settlements reveal iron shackles buried near domestic sites, suggesting that the line between wife and slave was thinner than sagas ever admitted. To a Viking chieftain, a captive bride could be paraded as both trophy and political tool, her foreign blood absorbed into the clan's growing web of power. What emerges from all these fragments scattered across centuries and languages is a picture of systematic psychological warfare waged against women. Brides entering these unions were stripped not only of autonomy but of privacy, forced to enact their most vulnerable moments before a community trained to see them as symbols of honor and property rather than human beings with their own fears and desires. It was industrial-scale dehumanization hidden beneath euphemisms, preserved in ledgers and celebrated in sagas that transformed horror into heroism. And for every bride who bled on a sheet while warriors waited outside, there were countless others who lived in the shadow of that fear. Young girls promised from childhood, captives dragged from burning villages, thralls whose fates were decided by a lord's whim. The wedding night was not an isolated moment of cruelty. It was the culmination of a system that weaponized intimacy, codified humiliation, and left scars not just on individuals but on entire generations of women whose names we will never know. The horror was not that these things happened in isolated moments of darkness. The horror was that they were normal, expected, celebrated. The horror was that they were woven so deeply into the fabric of Viking society that they became invisible to those who carried them out, as natural as the rising of the sun or the turning of the seasons. And perhaps the most haunting element of all is how thoroughly these rituals were buried by later generations, who could not bear to acknowledge what their ancestors had done. The Viking Age we celebrate today, with its fierce warriors and adventurous explorers, is a sanitized version of history, scrubbed clean of the systematic suffering that made that empire possible. But the bones of this truth remain, waiting in archaeological sites and forgotten manuscripts, in the words of outsiders who could not help but recoil at what they saw. The question we must ask ourselves is this: what other horrors lie buried beneath the myths we tell ourselves about the past? And what does it say about us that we would rather celebrate legends than confront the truth? If these buried truths have shaken you, if they've changed how you see the Viking Age, share your thoughts in the comments below. Where does history cross the line from fascinating to horrifying? And why do we work so hard to forget the darkest chapters of our past?